Hi, everybody. Welcome to those who are already here. See, we have a few in the chat, Teradito and Tiafair. Nice to see you all back here. Teradito says, I don't even really know what polarization means, but this sounds very interesting. Well, I hope it'll be interesting. At least it's a topic that I've, for a long time, been interested in. I suppose if I had to give a really quick synopsis, I would say that polarization is when society divides itself further and further into groups that are sort of defined by their ideology, and where each group's views are very distant from each other, and also where there's a lot of like emotional tension, like the groups not liking each other very much, a lot of antagonism, a lot of incivility. And this is a topic that I think a lot of people have been thinking about recently, because at least, so here I'm approaching this from a United States context, but if I understand correctly, it's not just the United States phenomenon, it's also in plenty of other places in the world. There does seem to be this increasing political polarization. And I'll say a little bit more in a moment about how I came to be interested in this topic. But I do think it's one that has a lot to analyze philosophically, a lot of interesting questions to ask and approach. So I'm hoping in this stream to read from some writings that I've done on it, and then maybe we can have some discussion about it. Tiafair, I'm so excited to be here. Oh, thank you, Tiafair. It's good to have you here. So yeah, one thing I will say about polarization before we actually start reading from the streams is that I think that the way that I first came to be interested in this topic was maybe about 10 or 12 years or so ago. I used to be more active on social media then than I am now. And one thing that I noticed, this was around the time that I think social media was starting to become more political for a lot of people. There was a time back when social media was more of just a thing for like posting, pictures of your friends and you hanging out together. Or at least that was the vibe that a lot of it seemed to have. But over time, politics came to have a greater role in it. At least that's my impression, and the impression that many people have shared is that it seems to be sort of more dominated by politics now in a way that it was not before. And one thing that I noticed a while back was that sometimes when discussions did get political, people whom I knew to otherwise be very kind, very reasonable people, very generous people, would speak to others and speak about others in ways that seemed very mean or very vicious. And it was just such a striking thing to see, not only because it was something that I saw in others, but also sometimes when I reflected on my own behavior. I would look back on discussions that I had taken part in and think, like, gee, I really wasn't quite as civil in that discussion as I normally like to be. And so it just got me thinking of, like, what exactly is going on here? And to the extent that it seems like a concerning thing, just what are the moral issues involved? Certainly my initial reaction to seeing it was quite negative. I was thinking, like, hey, there's something wrong here when people are speaking this viciously to each other. But one of the debates that came up is, well, what if one side really does have views that are repugnant or views that are just beyond the pale? Is it reasonable to always expect people to be civil? Maybe there's a certain value in calling out views that are repugnant in emotional terms. And so there's a debate to be had, not just on the causes of polarization or the effects of polarization, but even just more deeply on whether this kind of polarization or these kinds of emotional responses can maybe be justified. So some people are very in favor of a strong norm of civility that is pretty much universal, and then others favor a greater range of exceptions to that norm. So I think that's an interesting debate too. TFR says it's like if everyone is either a Hololive stan or a Niji Sanji stan, and we all fight viciously over which is better. I had not considered that as an analogy for polarization, but I think that is a very good analogy. Yeah, because in some ways it really does feel like competing fandoms when people have debates about politics on social media. So that's certainly not an observation that's original to me, but I do think that, yeah, that analogy is very apt, to be fair. Another thing about it, though, is that I think, like, in the past, I remember seeing it be a little more common for people, like, across ideological divides to talk with each other about these issues. But, I mean, not that I'm really that active on social media anymore, but I do recall feeling over time that it seemed like one effect, maybe, of you could say, of polarization is kind of a siloing of people. Like, people, like, only being friends with, like, others who agree with them, such that these conversations across the ideological divide just, might not happen as much in the first place, at least not anymore. See, if it's hard to imagine you're having been uncivil, but that's a great observation. Yeah, as much as I hate to admit it, I am not immune to whatever tendencies lead people to be uncivil sometimes. I like to think I've become better over time, but I have said many things that I regret and that I wish I could take back. Nisa, or I might be mispronouncing that. Nisa or Nisa says, hello, Axaeon. Well, hello to you as well. So with that as kind of a little intro, I think it's time to go ahead and start reading some posts about this, and I'll be really curious to hear what people think. And that curiosity, by the way, extends not just to, like, if you have questions you'd like to ask me, or thoughts of your own that you'd like to share on the topic, but also if you have objections, like if I say something in these posts that you think, like, hey, I'm not sure I agree with that, I hope you will feel free to share that as well, because these are topics that I certainly do not claim any certainty on. I think they're topics people can have reasonable differences of opinion on. And so to the extent that you have your own differences of opinion, I hope that you will feel open to sharing that. So in particular, just to get into the specifics, I'm going to read 2 posts today, or maybe 1.5, I should say. That one of the posts, I'm not going to read the entire thing, but there is a section on polarization from it that I would like to read. And that section is actually from the first blog post that I wrote, at least the first one on my current blog. Back in the day, I had an old blog that I don't keep up anymore, but on my sort of current ongoing blog, this was the first post that I wrote. So let's go ahead and hop over to it, and I'll look forward to reading it to you all. Okay, so here, why don't I just move over to this side, maybe make myself a little bit smaller. The title of this post is Possible Glimpses of a Higher Culture. And really, it's been almost a year since I wrote this post. So I guess I've been, going on close to a year now for this blog. And the idea for this first post was to put forth just some basic views of mine, some things that I think that are not just things that everyone agrees with, but things that are at least somewhat distinctive, things that I sense like, hey, there's room for reasonable differences of opinion here. And just to set them forth as kind of a foundation for later posts. So some of my later blog posts go into some of these things more. But one of the topics that I address in this initial post is political polarization. I'm just going to read the intro to this post and then some parts that follow. Also, before I start reading it, if anybody wants to follow along, I've just posted in the chat a link to it. So now you can look at it in your own browser if that makes it easier. So again, this post is called Possible Glimpses of a Higher Culture. Here for this first post, I'd like to outline a few features that I believe would make our culture healthier and more beautiful. While this piece will bring up these features only briefly, I'll explore at least some of them in more detail in future posts. Also, here I've tried to focus on claims that I imagine will be at least somewhat controversial, as I believe that that will make a more interesting contribution to discourse than simply recycling platitudes. Overarching comment. One's view of what a healthier culture would look like depends a great deal, I think, on one's view of human nature, if one believes that there is such a thing. Very roughly, a positive view of human nature would seem to favor a relatively freedom-giving culture, one in which people are left largely unencumbered. Sorry, I'm just trying to make myself not take up too much of the text. Okay, that's good. One in which people are left largely unencumbered, perhaps a yet better word would be undistorted, by restrictive customs, unchosen communal ties and obligations, and the like, instead being free to actualize, in their own far-branching ways, the fundamental goodness that's already radiating from their hearts. A negative view of human nature, by contrast, would more readily justify a culture that restricts people's ability to follow their individual inclinations, as these would tend to be seen as untrustworthy and in need of collective oversight. With this in mind, I believe that at least some of the points to come will have part of their origin, just how great a part is difficult to say, in my own belief in the goodness of human nature. Such a belief does not deny the wrongs people do. It does hold, though, that such wrongs are generally less a reflection of human nature than of the distortion and denial thereof. I think that any culture worth having would be guided, in various ways, by such a belief, together with the closely related belief in the unconditional value of the individual. Reducing polarization. If one feature of our culture troubles me most, it's the extent of political polarization. I've always found it unsettling to see people, especially, though not exclusively, those whose goodness I'm most directly aware of, those who have shown themselves in myriad ways to have generally a spirit of kindness, think and speak of vast swaths of their fellow humans, those with differences on some ideological orientation, with so much dismissiveness and contempt. Here I do not have in mind any particular side of political or cultural war disputes. To the extent that we can speak of such disputes as having broadly two sides, it seems to me that each side is all too often subject, in its own way, to the dark allure of hating those on the other. Insofar as we see all people as having value, the vicious extremes of political polarization cannot help but be concerning. The question we face, then, is what changes to our culture would make for less polarization? I believe that the most important such change would be for there to be a greater willingness to judge others by the whole of who they are, the totality of their beliefs, actions, emotions, dispositions, and so on, rather than reducing their entire being to a single purportedly bad belief or bad handful of beliefs that they happen to have. A willingness to in this way bear in mind the whole person would allow a greater recognition that, however ill-conceived or even repugnant someone's political or moral stance might be, the person herself can still be an entity of extraordinary value, someone whom a truly comprehensive perspective might well reveal to have much more in the way of virtues and noble moments. Such a person's worthiness of friendship or love, in genuine view of her whole being, may be no less great than ours, just as we ourselves, for all our own faults, can still be worthy of being befriended and loved. A related change that I'd propose is that a person's moral reputation be based much more on his actions than on his beliefs. Such a thought might seem plausible enough to most, though some of its implications are more controversial, such that it seems to me that many people, even if agreeing in some vague or minimally reflective way that actions matter more than beliefs, have not fully grasped just what such a standard means in practice. For example, I have black friends, quote, the kind of line that, in some circles, is routinely mocked as offering the paltriest evidence that a person is not racist against black people, would indeed, if actions matter more than beliefs, do more to suggest that a person is not racist than the fact that he has some arguably racist beliefs would suggest that he is racist. A culture that has overcome polarization would also, in my view, be one in which there's little, if any, offense-taking. To be clear, this doesn't mean that we would refrain from ever disapproving of things, but the particular kind of emotional valence involved in taking offense would be largely, if not entirely, absent. To the extent that someone did become offended by something, the problem would tend to be seen as lying with the person who feels offended, rather than with the person whose words or actions the offense is in response to. As all these thoughts suggest, I'm in favor of a culture that has a very strong respect for freedom of speech, and correspondingly, one that rejects cancel culture. Debate, even or especially spirited debate, has great value, but we should always likewise remember the value of whatever person we're debating with. Keeping this in mind, I think, would help debates not descend into mockery, shouting matches, contests to see who can insult the other in the most clever or extreme ways for the sake of getting more likes, or attempts to get someone ostracized, deplatformed, or fired from her job. More generally, I believe that we should reject, as far as possible, any way of thinking that would justify a cruel attitude toward someone else. As a side note, this is one reason why, when it comes to views on the ethics of punishment, I'm wary of retributivism. Were we to see truly, I think that we would see all pain, all death, as intrinsically unfortunate, even those instances that happen to be instrumentally good or necessary. Anytime we embrace a cruel attitude toward someone else, no matter whom, we lose a bit of our humanity. Now again, there is more to this post, but that's the part on polarization. So I'm going to go back to the just chatting screen. And the link is still there in the chat if anybody wants to keep it there to follow along, but I was thinking maybe we could just talk a little bit about that if people have thoughts they want to share. Again, there's a longer post I'm going to read in a moment, but yeah, first, if anybody has any questions or pushback they want to offer, those were some of my major kind of general thoughts on polarization. So I see we already have some comments in the chat. I'll just go ahead and start reading them. Stabby Stabby says, that is an interesting theory, although things like the social contract theory have been reached by both sides. Negative/positive thinking. Okay, interesting. I'm I'd be curious to hear a little more on the negative/positive thinking and how you see that relating to social contract theory. I don't doubt that there is a connection, but at this point, yeah, my mind is just in a state of, oh, cool, like I'd like to hear more. I mean, if the thought is that like there are certain claims that even in a polarized environment, both sides can't agree on, I mean, that seems right to me. And maybe some of them are even claims about like ethics. Like maybe certain parts of social contract theory, it sounds like the thought is. Maybe certain claims there the sides could agree on. I'm not sure if that's the thought. But I think there is potential there. Doesn't that possibly lead to the paradox of tolerance, though? So yeah, I'll say a few things on this. One of them is that, just to any viewers who might not know, the paradox of tolerance, at least as I understand it, is the thought that if we try to be as tolerant as possible and tolerate everything, well, then we run into a kind of contradiction, because we would have to tolerate intolerance. So we would have to tolerate people, being racist, being sexist, being homophobic, and so on, in their words and in their actions. And that ultimately seems like a less tolerant society than one in which we simply refuse to tolerate intolerance. So the thought behind the paradox of tolerance is like, look, if what we care about really is tolerance, we're going to have to be intolerant of some things. And when it comes to my thoughts on the paradox of tolerance, I think that it's right as far as it goes. Like, we can't just tolerate everything. Like, for example, serial killers, people who go around murdering, that's not something we can say like, oh, you go do you live your best life. Like, if that's what you want to do, go right ahead. We can't tolerate, violations to other people's rights. So that seems right as far as it goes. At the same time, I do think that the appeal to the paradox of tolerance is sometimes made very quickly and in a way that I think just abuses the paradox of tolerance, when people try to use it to argue like we shouldn't tolerate certain beliefs. Like, if we're just considering beliefs independently of actions, then I think that we should tolerate intolerant beliefs. Tolerate in the sense that we certainly shouldn't like lock people up for them. Like, if somebody has bad beliefs or like expresses bad beliefs, then sure, that's bad. Like, if this person is a racist, for example, or if this person is, extreme sexist, I think we can disapprove of that on a personal level. But I certainly would not be in favor of like the government issuing fines or prison sentences for that. I think that freedom of speech requires that we have a very broad tolerance for speech. Not a universal tolerance. Like, we can still, of course, make certain speech illegal. Like, if we're thinking in an American context, speech that the First Amendment does not protect. So these would be things like credible threats or bribes and so on, false advertising. So there are all kinds of speech that should be illegal, should be, punished, including punished by the government. But if we're just thinking of speech where we think like, hey, that's a bigoted viewpoint, then I think that having that be punished, at least punished, to any significant extent, especially if it's by the government, then that to me seems to put us on a slippery slope. I do not trust the government to determine what kinds of views are beyond the pale and which ones are not. Even if I did trust the government, at a certain point, like a certain administration, to make that determination, I would not trust the next one necessarily that comes along. And so I think that ultimately that would be giving too much power to the government. Now, when it comes to like individually, it is just like people, like social sanctions for speech, there it gets a little trickier. So for example, like if somebody is an extreme racist and then they get ostracized by their peers, that's not an example of, the government punishing speech, but it is an example of the speech being punished. So I think there's a reasonable question about like to what extent there's anything bad going on there. And my view on that, I would say a few things. one thing I would say is that I think in general, when people socially punish viewpoints that they don't like, I think the effect is often counterproductive. That is, if somebody has racist views and then all of the non-racist people around them say like, oh gee, like I don't want to be friends with this person because they have racist views. Well, the effect of that is that the only people who are going to be friends with this person are, other racists. And so this person's entire social circle now is going to consist of other racists who are going to reinforce the racist beliefs that they have. And the person is likely just going to be radicalized further. Whereas if the person, did have friends from like a broader, like ideological spectrum, let's say, maybe they could be exposed to the other side in a way that they're likely to take more sympathetically. Maybe that could help influence them, to become a better person. I think that the power of friendship and good faith dialogue to affect changes in people's views on these subjects is often underappreciated. So that's one thing I would say. I certainly think people have the right, not to be friends with, others whose views they don't like. So it's not a question of what people have the right to do. But if we're just thinking of what the right thing to do is, then I think even when it comes just to like social punishments and not government punishments, I think we should be very wary about the kinds of social punishments that we inflict on others, if it's just a case of the others like not having a view that we like. That was kind of a long-winded response, but I hope it gives at least somewhat of an indication of sort of what my views are on this topic. Tia Fair says, your mapping of individualism versus collectivism onto optimism versus pessimism has some truth to it, but it misses the fact that some people who prefer the former are spoiled at best and cruel at worst. If I'm understanding this comment right, it sounds like it's saying that some people who prefer individualism, who prefer like broad rights for the individual and thinking of the individual as having supreme unconditional value, things like that, are spoiled at best and cruel at worst. I mean, yeah, I suppose it's true that just having a belief, that I happen to share, like the sort of individualistic approach, doesn't guarantee that somebody has the good dispositions of character that might be shared by most, or at least by many people who have that belief. Yeah, they could have the belief, but still be, maybe a spoiled person in certain ways, or not a very nice person in certain ways. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I would disagree with that necessarily. I think that what you're saying there sounds pretty plausible to me. I would like to also say something about, this is in response to a comment that came up earlier about just what polarization is. Because I think this is an important thing to talk about too when we talk about polarization, is like just what is it? Because it has multiple aspects, multiple components. And one of them is just simply ideological. So there's when a society is divided into distinct ideological groups, such as left and right. And each of those groups are very distant from each other, and where the groups are also very internally homogeneous, where they don't show much variance within the group, where there's like a certain tribalism about believing sort of the party line on whatever issues one's own party or one's own group has a stance on. That is certainly one crucial component of polarization, when there are just those extreme ideological differences among people. But there are also a few other parts of it. It's like when people view these ideological groups as being central to their identity, to where it's not just like, oh yeah, I happen to have such and such beliefs or vote such and such a way, but where they think of this as being something that's part of the core of their character. And that, I think, is also an important part of polarization. Especially because when we think of our opinions in that way, it can be easy to see someone with a different point of view as sort of representing a threat or an attack on who we are as people in a way that we might not otherwise see it. So I do think there is a lot to be said there for just the sheer ideological component. Another component that is also very important, though, is what is sometimes called affective polarization. And this has to do with the emotions that are involved. So it's not just that people think very differently about, various issues, but also that there's a lot of emotion invested in these debates. And in particular, quite a bit of antagonism for the other side. So when the different ideological groups not just, think differently, but when they dislike each other, or fear each other, or even despise each other, I think that is certainly one of the key ingredients of political polarization, at least as I see it manifesting in our society currently. And with that antagonism come along some other aspects. Like one of them is incivility. So it's not just that people are feeling sort of negatively about the other side, but they speak negatively about each other. They mock and insult each other, which I think also feeds into the antagonism. It's kind of a vicious cycle of incivility leading to antagonism, which leads to more incivility. So if anyone was wondering kind of like if we're trying to fix the reference here of just like what is polarization, I would say it's the social phenomenon that kind of combines all of those features that I was just describing. It's like the extreme ideological differences, but also the antagonism, the heightened emotion, the incivility. Sort of the blend of all of that going on is what I see polarization as sort of amounting to. And one question about polarization that I sometimes think of is, well, okay, if polarization has increased in recent years, then what happens if it keeps increasing? Like, is there an endpoint to polarization? Like a point where polarization could hypothetically be maxed out? And some time ago, I wrote a post about this, trying to imagine what a society would be like where polarization is maxed out, and what the consequences of that would be. And so that is the other post that I wanted to share with you all today, which I'm going to read in just a moment. So in just a moment, I'm going to post a link to that in the chat, and then we can read it and talk about it a little bit. But first, I want to make sure I address all the comments. Let's see, Teradito says, heard a bit of epistemology, how rationalism is biased in a way that can make inhumane things rational. I know it was about rationalizing fascism, but I don't know well enough to apply it more generally. Yeah, I suppose there my main question would be about in what sense we're using the word rationalism. I know when I think of the word rationalism, at least as it sort of crops up in epistemology, what I usually think of is the difference between rationalism and empiricism, where rationalism says that there's knowledge that we can have that's sort of independent of our sensory experience. It's not grounded in our sensory experience. It's like maybe, for example, a certain knowledge of certain mathematical principles or like logical principles is like this. It's sort of justified in a way that is sort of purely a priori. Whereas empiricism says, look, no, our knowledge is ultimately, like all of our knowledge is grounded in the senses in some way. I don't know if that's the sense in which you're using it here. The mention of fascism makes me think that maybe you're using it in a different sense. But if you'd like to say more in a little while about that, then absolutely feel free, and I'd be glad to say more about it. But for right now, if it helps, I'm going to go ahead and post a link to the next post that I'm going to read. In fact, maybe I'll go ahead and pin this one as well, so anybody who joins later can see it. So this post is called "The Endpoint of polarization. And then here is... Oh yeah, I gotta go back to my screen for a moment. It's the endpoint of polarization, reasoned dialogues, point of no return. And I wrote this, by the way... Oh, sorry, I just realized you can't really see me. Maybe I'll... Yep, zoom in or scooch over a little bit. So I should say before I read this post that I wrote this around the time of the last American presidential election, which you can see there from the timestamp. So that was something that was very present in a lot of people's minds at the time, and still is, of course. But just know that that time frame, I think, will help with contextualizing some of the information that follows. Okay, so without further ado, this is the endpoint of polarization, reasoned dialogues, point of no return. A philosophical view that's long been close to my heart is that every person is of value. Perhaps it's not always the same degree of value. That is, it could very well be that certain factors, such as our actions, bear on the extent of our value as persons. Nevertheless, I like to think that at the core of each person, there lies something worthy of at least some degree of respect, reverence, compassionate regard, willingness to befriend, and to learn from. In each of us, there is both good and bad, but no matter how far-reaching the bad may be in a given case, it can never blot out the glimmer of goodness entirely. More and more, however, especially around elections, this has become a lonely view. Rather than expressions of universal kinship or value, one more often sees people demonizing vast swaths of their country, all those who differ in their orientation to hotly contested political disputes, as beneath contempt. The unblinking, bloodshot outrage of whichever side loses in a given election appears to be matched only by the maniacal glee that many on the winning side take in beholding the other's indignant misery. Those who can craft the most contemptuous insults or fling the most serrated words at the other side are cheered on by the extremes of their own. The spiral of mutual fear, distrust, and revulsion growing deeper all the while. Such political polarization raises many questions worth serious thought. Here I'll focus on the following. In light of the apparent increase in polarization over the years, is there an endpoint? What happens to the prospect of reasoned dialogue about contentious issues if polarization gets maxed out? And if indeed that happens, is there a way of returning to a less polarized environment? I'm writing about this in large part because I feel that the answers to these questions are unsettling. I also believe, though, that they reveal something new and important about the value of philosophy, a point I'll turn to near the end. Descent into irreconcilability. Consider the way reasoned discussion works when two persons disagree. They'll notice that they differ about some conclusion, and then one person or the other, or both, will put forth an argument for their preferred view or against the others. Such an argument will aim to have, and often will succeed in having, premises that the other person accepts. The two will then discuss whether the premises in fact support the argument's conclusion. To illustrate, here's a toy example of how two persons might begin a discussion of affirmative action. I think that affirmative action is wrong. It's unfair for job applications and college admissions to advantage or disadvantage applicants on the basis of demographic features, such as race and gender. It sounds as if we agree that it's important for job applications and college admissions to be fair. However, I think that the importance of fairness is exactly why affirmative action is necessary. Given the discrimination and unconscious biases that are all too present in our society, some applicants to colleges and jobs will have an easier time than others, and for reasons entirely out of their control, such as their race or gender. It's in this context that affirmative action is needed to level the playing field. In such discussions, sometimes one person will challenge one or more of an argument's premises. For example, if the above conversation were to continue, the first person might challenge the claims that discrimination and unconscious biases are widespread, or that affirmative action is, or would be, an effective way of addressing such discrimination and biases. When a premise is challenged in this manner, the person who put forth the premise might respond by attempting to marshal evidence for it, evidence that could itself be formulated as the premise of a new argument, an argument whose conclusion is simply the premise from before, the one that's been contested. While participants in such a discussion might not end up agreeing on the conclusion any more than when they started, what seems clear is that having a reasoned discussion at all depends on having at least some agreement somewhere. Agreement that could, in principle, inform the premises of an argument presented to the other side. But what if the participants in such a discussion can't find agreement about any substantive premises? What if they only encounter more disagreement at every step of the way? What if, in the example above, the two find themselves disagreeing not just about whether affirmative action is ultimately justified, but about whether it matters for college admissions and job applications to be fair, to what extent discrimination and unconscious biases exist, or even what methods we can use to determine the answers to such questions? It's here that I believe we come face to face with the real specter that polarization presents. That someday each side to major political and moral disputes will be so alienated from the other that reasoned debate and reconciliation will become no longer possible. More specifically, any premise that one side might appeal to as support for its position will be automatically rejected by the other. Indeed, will be seen by the other as yet further confirmation of derangement and depravity. Various examples suggest themselves. To take one, imagine a dispute about abortion. In a less polarized environment, the two discussants might view one another as having good faith differences of opinion. Differences that could very well be resolvable, at least in principle, about matters like when life begins, or what our duties are to entities whose degree of consciousness is unclear. Crank up the polarization enough, though, and the discussion, if it's even worthy any longer of the name, looks very different. One side, in arguing against abortion, might appeal to religious reasons, only to be met with the charge that religion itself is a millennia-long enterprise in rationalizing the oppression of women, and that the speaker's own religious convictions are simply further proof that he's a vile misogynist. The person saying this might then claim that preserving the legality of abortion is necessary to respect women's bodily autonomy, only to be met in turn with the charge that the autonomy to kill one's own children is no autonomy at all, and that she is an apologist for murder. Were the two to continue arguing, they would find, in response to every new point brought up, only further recriminations and outrage. To each side, the other's conclusion seems so heinous that it infects any premise that could possibly be used to argue for it. The result is a breakdown in reasoned dialogue and the near certainty of devolving into a shouting match instead. To arrive at such perfectly walled-off worldviews, impervious to challenge, hermetically sealed against any prospect of serious engagement with the other side, is no small feat. It requires achieving maximum coherence among each side's respective set of beliefs, as any inconsistency would be a crack in the armor, a weakness into which the other side might drive a wedge. And because people are imperfect reasoners who have trouble realizing the full set of implications of their foundational beliefs and commitments, and who, thus, often or typically neglect to work out their views accordingly, inconsistency has hitherto been, to some degree, present in the thinking of just about everyone. Such inconsistency has, perhaps ironically, often facilitated productive engagement between conflicting worldviews. To one with inconsistent beliefs, after all, having the inconsistency brought to mind can be an occasion to reflect on which of one's relevant beliefs might be mistaken, as well as whether an alternative worldview might, at least in the relevant respects, be more rational. And yet, however intractable it might be for humans on their own to iron out all the inconsistencies in their views, there's another player, soon to arrive on the scene, if not already here in the requisite fullness, who would plausibly have an easier time of it: AI. AI could be used to work out, with superhuman comprehensiveness and precision, sets of beliefs that are maximally coherent, maximally protected against any challenge from outside, as well as to calculate the most effective memes for inculcating such sets of beliefs among vast swaths of the populace. Should polarization ever be maxed out, it will likely be, in no small part, due to the use of AI in this way. Irreconcilability realized. Were the spiral into maximal polarization complete, many further changes to society would follow. Although, as will become clear in a moment, the direction of causality would ultimately go both ways. Following are what strike me as some of the most important such changes. In a maximally polarized environment, there would no longer be any recognition of expert consensus, nor even any recognition of someone simply, in a politically neutral way, being an expert on something. Instead, the only recognition of expertise would be for whichever experts happen to align with one's own political tribe. Any allegedly expert opinion that contradicts one's own political orthodoxy would be reflexively dismissed as a product of untrammeled bias and ideological capture. And given the hyperpolarized environment, such a charge would, in many or most cases, perversely, have a certain plausibility. Going hand in hand with the breakdown of trust and general politically unvalenced expertise would be a persistent inability of those on competing sides to agree even on basic facts. How many unarmed black men were killed by police in a given year? How effective are vaccines at preventing the relevant illnesses? How much income do women earn relative to men when various factors are accounted for, such as job type, hours worked, and so on? To what extent is immigration linked with an increase in crime? Did certain luridly reported crimes, such as roving immigrants stealing and eating people's pets, in fact happen? To what extent is climate change occurring, and, insofar as it is, to what extent are human activities causing it? In all such controversies, what we'd find would go well beyond the familiar bias of being more likely to agree with a news report if it reinforces one's own beliefs, and into the territory of outright refusing to believe any report, no matter how well documented, that in any way challenges one's beliefs. This inability to agree would likewise extend to how each side views rhetorical clashes with the other. Of any debate between experts, politicians, public intellectuals, and so on, insofar as there's even anything left worthy of the name debate. Each side will have radically diverging perceptions, coming away thinking that its person dominated the other. For me, such a prospect calls to mind one of the most alienating kinds of phenomena I've seen in discourse, namely cases of someone's more or less shouting an opponent down, not letting him get a word in, spewing sheer vitriol rather than arguments, and then to see many in the audience respond with applause and cheers, satisfied in the conviction that the shouter was the one who won the debate. In such an environment, any concession to the other side would be seen as a betrayal of one's own, an unacceptable turning of one's back on something of civilizational importance, an importance all controversial issues would be seen to hold. The question, what is the truth of the matter, would be at most an afterthought. The primary question driving people's thoughts and actions would be, does this help my side? Or perhaps better yet, does it hurt and enrage the other? Motivated in this way, each side would see no rhetorical or argumentative tactics, no extremes of misinformation or propaganda as off limits. All the familiar rationalizations would be embraced in full heartedness. It's okay when we do it, since we're the good guys, the ones doing it for the side of justice. The other side's already doing it. We tried taking the high road before, and look how that didn't get us anywhere. We must fight fire with fire. A further upshot of such hyperpolarization, living neutrally, or even simply maintaining an appearance of neutrality, would no longer be possible. Each side's mentality would be, if you're not with us, you're against us. Purity tests and tribal markers would become more pervasive, more pronounced, as no one would be willing to tolerate uncertainty about where someone stands. Be that person a neighbor, a coworker, a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, a friend. And so, in time, the politicization of ordinary life, ordinary things, would become all-consuming. Our speech, mannerisms, fashion, jobs, cars, social media sites we use, movies we watch, stores we buy from, video games we play, books we read, schools we send our kids to, and beyond. All would, in some way or another, be subsumed into a scheme of tribal signaling that every person must heed, on pain of ostracism from her preferred group. For a sufficiently severe or unatoned for misstep into the other tribe signals would be seen as an intolerable provocation. Indeed, given the non-negotiable importance of tribal purity, perhaps the most intense rage of each side would ultimately be for those who, while having been part of the in-group, are one day judged to be insufficiently committed to the group's orthodoxy, or worse yet, to be flat-out heretics. With all the frothing further of Puritans trying to root out witches and secret sin, each side would find itself relentlessly marked by internecine shaming and disputes. Footnote: much has been written about the prospect of political fanaticism as a substitute for religion. In a maximally polarized environment of the kind I'm describing, perhaps political disputes would take on some of the characteristics of holy wars. The most apt analogy I can draw for the whole intellectual and cultural climate being described here, and particularly for the conflicting sets of beliefs involved, is that of two tight chess formations in which each piece is guarded by some other piece, and in which, further, each piece is given the importance of the king piece, so that no piece can venture out and put itself in check. The two sides thus find themselves locked in a grinding stalemate. Were society truly to find itself in such a stalemate, then I fear that we would find ourselves past an intellectual point of no return, a point at which reasoned discussion between conflicting sides will have become impossible. As with the apocalypse or the heat death of the universe, there would be no plausible prospects for going back. And this is why I see a descent into hyperpolarization as one of the main threats to our future. Some might wonder whether there could, in such an event, still be hope for a return to saner times. If there were any hope of making reasoned dialogue possible again, I suppose such hope would, ironically, lie in non-rational factors. For example, if someone on one side were helped in an important way, such as by having his life saved by someone on the other, perhaps that would make the first person a bit more sympathetic to the other side, or at least more willing to listen with an open mind. However, in a hyperpolarized environment, the hope of such non-rational factors playing out that way would appear low. If you saw someone as part of a group that threatens and undermines you, all the people you care about, and even your very civilization, would you save his life? An alternative hope for a return to open-mindedness and rational discourse, some might argue, would lie simply in generational change. Even if we ourselves one day become past reconciliation, perhaps our children would be more willing to extend an olive branch to one another. Alas, though, given that our children would themselves be growing up in a hyperpolarized environment, it's unclear whether they'd find it in themselves to break the cycle or simply carry it on further. Even if they or their descendants someday did overcome polarization, it might well take many generations. And in the meantime, what would be left for us? Were the prospect of reasoned discussion trashed and buried for the time being, and with each side seeing the other as an existential threat, and with mutual outrage compounded by the day, ramping up like the whistle of a tea kettle that's on the verge of boiling over, what then? The only natural step left for engaging with the other side would be violence. And that would be the true culmination of the descent into hyperpolarization, a point when battles over ideas are fought not with reasons and evidence, nor arguments and thought experiments, nor statistics and studies, nor even simply insults and memes, but with bullets and knives, bombs and clubs, fists and teeth. The role of philosophy. To some, the above description of a maximally polarized world will seem like unbridled speculation, a product of a fanciful imagination left for too long to indulge in its own wonderings. I truly hope that they're right. For my part, I can only say that the world described above is one that every instance of polarization in our own, every sneering insult, every shouting match, every family fractured, every friendship severed, every moment of fiendishly gleeful collective schadenfreude calls me to imagine. In a maximally polarized world, one that's past the intellectual point of no return described earlier, philosophy would, practically speaking, appear to no longer have much role to play. But it does have a role to play now. Much of the value, the urgency of philosophy, I feel, lies in stopping us from getting to such a point. By embracing the philosophical ethos, the ethos of adopting epistemic humility, being charitable to opposing views, communicating honestly, rejecting ad hominem and guilt by association and groupthink and motivated reasoning, being willing to question our own deepest beliefs, following the arguments wherever they lead. Through all this, we can ensure that we do not fall into the impenetrably polarized nightmare world described above. This is not to suggest that we must all be philosophers, nor is it to deny that philosophers themselves have sometimes been among polarization's most insidious exacerbators. What I do wish to express is simply that if we are to take an effective stand against the tide of polarization, then the way each of us must follow is, at its core, the philosopher's way. So thank you everyone for listening to that. Just going to bring myself back over here. I know that post was a bit longer than the previous one I wrote. Again, just as with the previous one, I'm happy to consider any thoughts or questions or objections that people have. So yeah, let's open it up for some discussion. And while we do so, actually, I'm just going to pause for a moment. It's gotten quite dark in my room because the sun has gone down. I'm just going to turn on a light. Okay, that's better. So while I was reading, I was not able to see the comments, but I'm going to take a look now and just, yeah, kind of see what people have been saying. Okay, yeah, quite a few comments left. I don't know if I'll be able to cover all these, but let's see if let's just start at the beginning. So Stabby Stabs, I think an interesting thought about modern, in America at least, polarization is that we've always been a very individualist, polarizing country throughout our young history. Interesting observation. Yeah, especially with the individualism and the American dream and being able to make a life for yourself in America. I do agree with that sort of individualist picture of the way our country has sort of played out. For polarizing, I mean, it is true that the current moment in this country is not the only one when there's been significant political polarization. In fact, one might argue that it was maybe even greater at some points in the past. One thing I will say, though, is that, and I think there is good evidence to support this, this is not just a subjective impression, but if you look at various surveys that have been done, like the Pew Research Center has a lot of good surveys on this, is that over the past like 20 or 30 years, let's say, there has been a significant increase in polarization. And for example, people reporting that they strongly disapprove of the other side, or that they have fewer friends who disagree with them on important issues or political issues, or that they would be disappointed if their kid married someone from the other side. And likewise, just in the nature of discourse, political discourse, I think that when we look at the way debates are done today, it seems to me to involve much more in the way of mudslinging, insults and mockery than at least at certain points in the past. Again, maybe not every point in the past, but if you go back a few decades, I do think things were quite different in that regard. If I might be permitted to just share a little bit about a subjective impression that I have. When I was growing up, I remember there not being a sense of just as much of people hating each other over politics. It felt like it was more common for people to have, friends who disagree with them. Admittedly, maybe that's just because I was a little kid and things seemed, more happy-go-lucky in general. But I know I'm not the only one who has had that impression, and apparently there is quite a bit of survey data to back it up. TFAR says, no, Axaeon, not the AI. It's coming whether we like it or not. But yeah, that is one of the prospects that kind of troubles me about this, is thinking like how AI might play into polarization. I think it's one of those things that not a lot of people have thought about in depth. Some have. Like Scott Alexander has a very good short story that kind of explores this prospect of sort of AI exacerbating polarization. But it is one that I think is going to sort of be on the stage very soon, if it's not already. So yeah, TFAir, another comment. First, I think the endpoint you speak of is already here, at least the stage of tribally determined ideology and a breakdown in mass media. Obviously, it isn't unilateral yet, as shown by this stream. Okay, yeah, one thing that intrigues me there is you say the endpoint is already here, although you do qualify it saying at least the stage of tribally determined ideology and a breakdown of mass media. To me, it is a very difficult question to say, like, just how far away we are from that endpoint. There's a part of me that's tempted to say, like, oh yeah, we're really close to like maxing out polarization. But I'm also kind of wary about, like, there's a part of me that also feels, isn't it possible that in the future, like, we will come across a point when polarization is much greater, and then like we look back to today and think, like, oh gee, like things back then were like a lot less polarized. Like you could at least broadcast your political opinions and like not expect to get punched in the face, like, if that were like a normal thing in the future. So I don't know how far away we are ultimately from max polarization, but I do think it's an interesting question of like just what that max polarization would look like. That was kind of the motivation for this post. Second, I don't see how AI has the capacity to do as you say when so far its shtick is parroting what people say, and if people are saying unintelligent things, well, yeah, it's... Let's see, what would be the best way to, or the best thing to say here? I'm trying to think of a way to articulate it. I certainly do not claim to be an expert on how AI works, but it does seem to me like a plausible prospect, at least, that given the advances in AI over the last few years, including when it comes to things like generating images and videos, and doing so really convincingly, it seems plausible to me that AI could be somehow trained on like what features of discourse lead people to be maximally engaged, including if the engagement takes the form of outrage, and what features most reliably generate outrage in people, and that could maybe be used for the purposes of sort of rallying people or pushing a certain ideology. Like maybe at some point it'll be like you could input like a prompt of like, hey, like I have this view that I want to spread among people. I want people to get talking about. I want to drum up outrage against the other side involving such and such an incident from recently. Can you put together some memes for me like that will reliably do this? Yeah, to me it seems like Like, that's not too far out of the realm of possibility. Terodito says, honestly, I don't know enough to confidently speak on rationalism and ethics. Okay, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. I think believing science is better than indigenous practices are better is an example of it, as the latter is better at maintaining biodiversity, but we only see the reasoning in the first. Okay, yeah, I guess when it comes to that kind of example, I suppose one thing that could be going on is maybe there are different senses of better. Like, when it comes to the scientific method, we might think that maybe that's epistemically better in some ways, insofar as it involves like arriving at justified beliefs, or beliefs that are arguably more justified, about the natural world than something like indigenous practices. Although maybe the indigenous practices are, you might say, like instrumentally better, or they have maybe better consequences for the environment, at least sometimes. Though in that case, I wonder if maybe the consequences of science, like maybe there would be more consequences of technology. And we use science to develop the technology, but like maybe the consequences would come from like the use, or at least the widespread use of certain technologies more than the science. So I guess that's a distinction I would want to make. So the AI thing just seems like a non sequitur that detracts from the overall article. Okay, well, thank you for the feedback. Yeah, maybe it does. I can't say I agree at this point, but I'm open to that possibility. So if you'd like to say more on that, then feel free. And then, okay, we have a whole subsequent discussion of the AI here in the chat. Stabby stab. I think the point you was making with AI is that it could come up with solutions without emotional bias. The current level of AI is nowhere near being able to do that. It brings up other issues. Like a hypothetical AI could be beyond polarization. I mean, yeah, I do think that when we think about AI, it doesn't seem like the AI itself would be polarized. Unless we imagine, I mean, I guess you could say, like, you could argue if the AI is trained, like, exclusively on materials that, like, is all in favor of a certain viewpoint, like, maybe then the AI would be polarized. And there could be models, that are like that. People could develop models in that way. But even if the AI itself isn't polarized, it's easy for me to imagine that it could be used for the purpose of, like, increasing polarization. Just in the way that it's useful for lots of purposes today, like including purposes that involve communicating with people, or advertising, or influencing people's opinions through all kinds of, like, image and video generation. I don't think it would be too far away from the capabilities of current AI to predict or to sort of generate text, images, memes, advertisements that pretty reliably get people to think poorly, or to think worse of the other side, or to become more outraged at the other side. Terodito, I like it when there's a don't forget philosophers can suck too, and when they do, god damn. Yeah, I try to call out other philosophers and just philosophers in general when we have issues. No group of people is perfect. That includes philosophers as much as anyone. I'm in agreement about stopping the current trajectory before it's too late, and that philosophy will have a role in such an endeavor. Yeah, at least I like to think that philosophy would have a role in that. At least if philosophy can't prevent it, then I'm not sure what can. I think we are in a more polarized time than normal, but historically, we have been worse. Okay, yeah, I mean, that seems plausible to me. And I guess some issues one could think of when it comes to this, like, especially if we go back to the time of, like, the Civil War. At the very least, one thing we can say for our present time is that people are not, engaging in outright civil war with each other. And there are probably other times one could appeal to from history too, but that's, yeah, one example that comes to mind that I think backs up what you're saying here. On a side note, it is hard to do fully fleshed out thoughts with a character limit. Yeah, no, I sympathize with that. It's easier for me to sort of offer comments in this discussion than it is for you all. I'm not subject to the character limit, so I do try to be mindful of that. Terodito, remembered an actual politics history thing I read, how the best activism is just asking a simple question everyone can feel, which I think would fit your idea of it being non-rational. Okay, yeah, I'd be curious to know like what some examples are. Like if it's a question that influences people not by like causing them to reflect like intellectually, but like it inspires a certain emotion in them, then yeah, I guess I could see that being a non-rational influence. Like one example that comes to mind, although this one I think there's also some rational stuff going on, so but maybe also some non-rational stuff, is the activist Daryl Davis. I'm not sure if you all know about Daryl Davis, but he's one figure that I often think about when it comes to polarization. And for his background, Daryl Davis is a black man who has become friends with many members of the Ku Klux Klan, which is the extremely racist, historically racist organization against black people, and to the point that involved in criminal activities, and in the past just horrible history there. And so these are very unlikely friendships, but one thing that is interesting about them is that through his friendships, Davis has inspired many people to leave the Ku Klux Klan and to give up their racism. Over 200 of them, I believe, is his count, so according to him. And the way that Davis approaches them, or the way that he, I guess, first started approaching them when he was sort of starting out in this endeavor, is sort of driving all of his actions by the question, like, how can you hate me if you don't know me? So it was that question that was very present in his mind, and that kind of inspired him to get to know these people better. And so when it comes to your comment about like a question that could make people feel, that comes to my mind as an example of one of those kinds of questions. Like if somebody is very racist and they're confronted with the question, like, how can you hate me when you don't know me? Maybe that's a question that can inspire a certain compassion, or at least start the process of reflecting in a way that leads to compassion. Although AI could theoretically make things better, it is sadly owned by people who benefit from making things worse. Forget the clankers. We philosophers have got to step up. Yeah, philosophers rise up. That is a message that I love. I am a little afraid to use words like clankers. It makes me think like, oh no, like what if in 20 years, during like the AI robot uprising, like, will I get canceled for this? Will they kill me for this? But very much agreed. Philosophers do need to step up when it comes to issues like this. Terodito, all right, quick. Dictatorship, disappearing people. One of the things that made it not be buried history, others uniting against the government for one question everyone understands. Where are our sons? Oh, okay, yeah, that's a powerful question. You can see how that one is the kind of question that can help inspire social change. Or at least inspire people, remembering the actions of dictatorships and not just being led to forget them. Well, everyone, there's someone who questioned a mother's love here. Yeah, no, you got me on that one. I see you were present for my other stream, that about love. And for anyone who might be new to the chat and not have been present for that stream, the blog post I was reading then was about parents' love for their children, and the sort of angle I was presenting was that, well, on one hand, when I think about other people who love me, I really want the love to be in response to qualities about me, qualities that I have. Like, for example, if they think I'm, a good person, or if they like my thoughts or my personality, I want the love to be in response to that. If the love just turns out like not to be based on anything about me, then to me it seems that the love is arbitrary, and it just seems personally a bit troublesome to think like, oh, well, like, could they have just as easily have loved like somebody else, or like a tractor or a rock, and like, not have loved me? And so the puzzle I was raising is that, well, on one hand, like, that thought seems very natural to me, but then on the other hand, like, many people will say that like the most pure love there is the love of parents for their children, like including newborn children, even though the children, the newborns, haven't yet done anything, haven't yet developed a personality, and so on. And so I wrote a post about kind of that conundrum. And I think ultimately what I would, like, if I don't have any kids, but if I were to have kids, at least I can't say for sure like what I would feel, but it seems very easily imaginable to me that I might not love the kid, at least not immediately. Like when they're newborn, like I might feel positively toward them in the way that I feel positively toward babies in general. But like it wouldn't be anything special about mine. It would be just like, oh, like this is a baby. And then I could see the love growing over time, like as the baby grew into a person and developed a personality and so on, and I could see the love growing then. So that's just my own kind of imagining of what my experience might be like. Though there are a lot of people who would say, like, Axaeon, are you crazy? Like, for thinking this? So yeah, it's one of those views of mine or imaginings of mine that I think a lot of people would maybe find a little strange. But it is something I think. Stabby stabby, racism tends to come from either ignorance or looking for someone to blame. Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that examples like Daryl Davis bear that out, is that when these people from the Ku Klux Klan encounter a black person like Daryl Davis, someone who's willing to be friends with them, who's willing to see like whatever goodness there is in them, like is willing to show them the goodness that he has, then their ignorance about what about people of other races is diminished somewhat. They come to see like, oh, like here's someone who like doesn't fit all the nasty stereotypes that I've had about people of this race, and that naturally leads them to become less hateful. It leads them to reduce their racism the more they kind of get out of that ignorance. I guess you could also draw a similar point about gay rights, that for a lot of people, the sense of, like back when it used to be way more taboo to be gay, way less accepted, there was often a sense of like people, or at least people who were not very friendly to the idea of others being gay. Like maybe they just didn't know any gay people. But like now it's even if it's not perfectly accepted, like it's at least like way more accepted than it was in the past. And now it seems like ask pretty much any person will know like at least a few gay people. And so maybe that's a potential example of people no longer being as ignorant of like, oh, like there are gay people out there, and hey, they're not just like these weird or like bad people, they're like my friends, they're people like who seem like good people. And yeah, like that's been crucial in the kind of greater acceptance of gay identity, gay sexual orientation. And then yeah, what you say also, to be fair, yeah, there's that other part of your comment, Stabby Stab, that I didn't really touch on, of looking for someone to blame. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of it too, is that when people are suffering, it's very natural for them to try to find an explanation for that suffering. And unfortunately, in many cases, the explanation that they kind of hit on involves blaming someone else, even when it's someone who might not have any plausible connection to the suffering. It can be very tempting to try to latch on whatever we can find, to explain why we're suffering or why we're doing poorly in some area. So yeah, often that does take the form of kind of blaming others. This is a more general comment, but I do want to say I'm liking the comments that people are leaving. I think that they're doing a nice job of showing different angles on polarization that one might take, and also raising some challenges to things that I've said, which is always good. I think that's something we should always be open to, is open to being challenged on things that we think. So I try to embody that when others are raising challenges to what I've said. Another thing I'll say about polarization, this is more, and I guess about the causes of it. Because like one big question here is like, okay, why now? Like, why is polarization increasing so much? And I guess there are really a few things one could say. And I don't know if, like, it's like what I present now is not going to be an exhaustive explanation, but I do think one thing that is going on is that on one level, just humans have kind of naturally some susceptibility to tribal thinking. And there is likely an evolutionary explanation for this, involving our history, in hunter-gatherer groups, and maybe having a natural tendency there to think in terms of like us versus them, our tribe versus their tribe. And so I think that in our current environment, maybe that natural tendency is getting somewhat exploited. Of course, there are plenty of social factors that are sort of distinctive to this time that are going on, and one of them is the sort of presence, the proliferation of social media, and the attention economy. And this is especially an issue when it's combined with our negativity bias. So that is our tendency to kind of hyperfixate on things that either seem negative, like where that represent something that we're afraid of, that we think threatens us, or that we think is bad, or if it's like someone else doing something that we think involves them calling us bad. And I suppose there's probably also an evolutionary explanation for that bias, because if we think about like potential threats that our ancestors would have faced, even just ignoring a threat on one occasion could lead to death. And so it's easy to see how our brains would kind of naturally have this tendency to kind of focus on the negative, which in the context of social media could take the form of like when we see the other side. Let's see, what would be a good example here? Like whatever actors from the other side are engaged in like the most extreme vitriol against their own, like those are the ones that get the most attention or the most clicks or the most views. And that leads us to think of like, oh, all people on the other side are like that one extreme person. So that's also, I guess, one contributor to it. Social media making outrage profitable is one of the main culprits, I'd say. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. That one of the surest ways of getting clicks, getting views, is to just be extra severe in one's rhetoric, to try to craft the most extreme insults of the other side, or to try to paint the other side in the most bad light. And yeah, certainly, like if that were not the case, then I don't think we would have as much polarization as we currently do. It also seems to me, though, this is, I guess, slightly a deeper level than what I was saying earlier, is that I think for many people, the indignation that they feel about political issues is the cheap and easy route to a sense of meaning. And so one thing that just seems to me to be going on is that when people don't feel that there's sufficient meaning in their lives, like maybe they're not doing what they really want to do, they don't feel that they're really contributing to the world in the way that they want to contribute, it can be very easy in that kind of context to look for meaning, and in particular to look for meaning from things that one feels, a very deep opposition to. So thinking, okay, like what am I opposed to, like most strongly opposed to? And maybe that becomes part of their identity. Which makes me think of a corollary, which is that if people in general did feel more meaning in their lives, like if they were able to have work, have an occupation that they maybe felt more fulfilled in, if they had relationships that they felt more fulfilled in, then I don't think there would be as much temptation to kind of build their sense of meaning on divisive political differences that they have from others. So admittedly somewhat speculative, but that is something that seems to me to be the case. And it's especially concerning, I think, because, well, I mean, there are lots of reasons for being concerned about political polarization. Some of them are ones that I went into in the post, like sort of the inability to agree on basic facts. So facts are like, whether fracking is dangerous, or like to what extent climate change is occurring, or like rates of illegal immigration and so on. Like these are things that one might think like we could all arrive at the same answer to, but it turns out they're just so heavily politicized that even on basic factual questions like this, there's lots of disagreement. But even beyond that, there's just the sense of like when a society is so polarized, it becomes a lot more difficult for people to work together. In any complex society, getting things done is likely to involve compromising, at least sometimes, with the other side or with other sides, with people who might disagree with you. But with greater polarization comes, a greater unwillingness to compromise, a greater unwillingness to work together, which I think leads to things like political gridlock. And so that's a whole further angle that I think one could be concerned about. Stabby Stab says, seems we are in the nihilistic world Nietzsche talked about. Let me think about this here. So yeah, when I think about that statement, I'll just say a bit about what I think of it. You can tell me if you agree with this, if this is sort of how you read Nietzsche. But the nihilistic world Nietzsche talked about, for me, that phrase makes me think of Nietzsche's statement that God is dead, is that our meaning, sense of meaning, no longer comes from God. Now we have to kind of build it ourselves. And of course, Nietzsche himself was in favor of what he called a revaluation of all values. So kind of, building one's own values, creating one's own values. But maybe the nihilistic world is like a world where we haven't yet done that. Like we haven't yet managed to build our own values. So that there's like the death of God, but then we're sort of in this transitional stage before we've created any values to replace God. So I wonder if that's the thought maybe you're getting at, Stabby Stab. If so, then I guess one thing I would say is maybe like one thing we could say, not that this would be like a very good defense of them maybe, but like one thing people today could say, or people who are very susceptible to polarization could say, is maybe they have created some values. It's like they're not nihilists maybe, but their values just happen to be like advancing their political cause. Like maybe that for them has become the meaning of their life. Whereas a nihilist might just say, look, there is no meaning of my life. At least that's what I would want to say about a lot of people like this. Like if I try to interpret them charitably, then I'm inclined to say that they probably think of meaning in their life as sort of coming from, at least coming largely from, their sort of political activities or political views. Yep, that is what I was thinking of before the Ubermensch have come along. Okay, yep. Tia Fair says, yes, a desire for belonging and purpose is certainly another one. It's quite messy. Yeah, well said. I think we're on the same page here. God is dead. Politics is the new religion. Yeah, I know. I think that's an apt observation, or at least, yeah, for many people. Of course, it gets a little tricky when we think about how, like, there are a lot of people for whom religion is itself like a part of politics. And like for other people, like people on the other side, maybe like the lack of religion might be just as important to them. So I guess sometimes these can be intertwined, but it does seem right to say that, like, whereas in the past, like pretty much everyone would have had like a more or less shared belief in God, and sort of the society's sense of meaning as a whole might have come from that. Yeah, we certainly don't have that anymore. I don't fully agree with the Nietzsche solution or Ubermensch concept, though. Okay, intriguing. Yeah, I would be curious to hear about why. Not that I'm a Nietzschean myself. Like, my own view is that for our choice of values to be meaningful at all, it can't just be something we create that is not justified by anything objective, because then it would just be an arbitrary choice. And I don't think meaning in life can be based on anything arbitrary and still be satisfying. So for myself, I would be in favor of appealing to certain objective values, like saying, well, kindness is good, and that's an objective moral value, an objective fact. Like even if somebody thinks kindness is not good, or if I were to think kindness is not good, it's not that kindness wouldn't be good for me, it's just I would be wrong. Like, kindness would still be good, and I would just be mistaken. So if we think of objectivity in that way, then yeah, I guess I would say I'm much more in favor of appealing to objective values as sort of the ground of one's sense of meaning. Speaking of meaning, another thing that I think is, this goes back to the effects of polarization. I think one of them is just the fact that there's so much friendship and love that is lost, that is missed out on, that would have been there, that people would have been open to if not for the extremes of polarization that we see today. And to me, there's something just so tragic about that, to think about all of the loving relationships and all of the friendships that there could be, or that there could have been, and for all of that to be replaced with fear and anger. I think that the friendship and the love are things that are intrinsically valuable, and so I think that we should do what we can to cultivate relationships like that, which is difficult to do when we're sort of overcome with hatred for the other side. Stabby says, I do like a lot of Nietzsche writing, but it is a bit too elitist, and is something that can only work on an individual level, not a societal level. To be fair, his philosophy was only meant for the few, he wrote so himself. Okay, yes, that is a good note. If we're trying to be fair to Nietzsche, then we do need to keep that in mind. Though my follow-up question there would be, like, what does it mean for the writing, in this case his writing, to work for someone? Like, to work on an individual level? Because to me, at least, it's not, like, obvious what that means. Like, it doesn't mean that the person decides to go about like creating their own values and feels satisfied with their life, like feels like their life has meaning. Maybe that it would be what it means for Nietzsche's writing to work for that person. Yeah, I mean, that's one way you could look at it, but I think my question there would be, like, it isn't the more salient question whether that person in fact has a satisfying meaning to their life. And isn't this something that, like, in principle, somebody could be mistaken about? Like, maybe someone decides their values are such and such things, but and they think that gives their life meaning, but like maybe it doesn't in fact give their life meaning. Yeah, to me, I would want to say like what seems to work when it comes to meaning in life is, like, is the person's life in fact meaningful, like considered objectively? Of course, I know Nietzsche wouldn't have agreed with that, but that's what I would want to say when it comes to meaning for whatever it's worth. So in just a moment, I'm probably going to head out, but I'll pause here and just wait a few more seconds, or maybe just another few moments if people want to post any more comments to kind of round things out. One thing I will say is that I have enjoyed the discussion. So all those who have been posting comments like Stabby Stabby, TFAir, and Teradito, I really appreciate your thoughts. Well, to be a true Nietzschean, you would have to do the whole lamb to lion to baby process, which few people would be able to do properly. Okay, yeah, it seems like I will admit that that particular part of Nietzsche's writing is something I have not read for a while, so I might not remember all of it fully. But yeah, it does sound like if it's a process that Nietzsche advocated, chances are it's not going to be something most people are able to do properly. He wasn't really in favor of putting forth standards and that most people could meet. He was more on the elitist side. I think this can of worms we opened is a bit too big to inspect in one short stream. True, yeah, occupational hazard of of philosophical questions there. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, there's a lot more on this that we could go into that would far exceed the length of this stream. One was truly being honest with themselves, which is extremely difficult. It would lead to self-actualization. Oh, like the honesty would lead to self-actualization? Yeah, that's an interesting claim. I'm trying to think if... Could one be honest with oneself, but not be self-actualized? And... yeah, I don't know if I have a settled view on that. Like, I'm thinking of someone who's, like, really honest with themselves, like, doesn't shy away from any acknowledging, like, all parts of themselves, but it is still just, like, not living a life they're really happy with. Maybe, like, they're not in a job they're happy with. But then I guess you could say if the person were really honest with themselves, like, why would they be in a job they're not happy with in the first place? Like, maybe the self-honesty would lead them to make decisions in all areas of their lives that, you know, lead them to being self-actualized. So I could see room for that kind of view. Stabby, stabby, yeah, it is my bad. Hey, no worries, man. I think that you know, whatever questions people bring up, I'm happy to look at. Not that it was a waste to try. I really enjoy these themed reading and debating streams. Already looking forward to the next one. Oh, thank you. Yeah, for the next one, I'm not quite sure what I'll read. I do have some thoughts, though, some interesting possibilities that I think people will like. So I'll leave you all in suspense for right now about what they are. But rest assured, there are going to be some future ones. All right, so yeah, I think that's all for this evening. Again, thank you all for coming, and I will look forward to seeing you in my next stream. Tomorrow, I will be streaming Star Trek Resurgence, which I tried to stream earlier this week, but ran into some trouble. In particular, a very annoying audio glitch, which those of you who were present in this stream, you might have memories of this when I was trying to get the main character's dialogue to come through. It was coming through for me, but not on stream. Well, I looked it up and I found out what the issue was. It was just a matter of the spatial sound box, so ticking that off instead of like Windows Sonic for headphones. I have no idea why that made the difference, but it did. I tested it, and so tomorrow we should be able to get it to work. And then next week I'll be having some further streams and trying to maybe put out another video or two at some point. It's really interesting to hear. See ya, and next time it will work for sure. Thank you for your vote of confidence, Teradito. That means a lot. All right, so for real this time, thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye for now.